Amen. Well, let's open our Bibles this morning to Mark chapter 8, verse 22. As we continue our study with Mark, this morning we come to kind of a pivotal point in the gospel. In fact, all of the gospels have it, where Jesus, in the final year before the cross, turns from the large crowds and the mass meetings and really hides himself many times from them to just minister to 12 guys. Because their understanding of why he is here and who he is a long way from where it needs to be. This morning in our verses down through the end of the chapter, we are given three very short little paragraphs that really all relate. There is the restoration of a man born blind, or at least it is blind, his physical sight. There is the revelation of spiritual sight that God gives to all men. And then there is the reminder that if you're going to follow him, he's got to be the Lord, not you. So in all three of the examples, they scream out, Jesus is God. He opens the eyes of the blind. He makes the blind spiritually to see, and he's the Lord that you have to follow. It isn't a lesson that the disciples would learn overnight. It's not one you and I learn overnight. It takes a long time to get to the point where you go, all right, you can be the Lord. A long time after you believe in him and trust him, oftentimes before you'll surrender to him. But that's our message of seeing him and then serving him. Verse 22 says this. Then he came to Bethsaida, and they brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. So he took the blind man by the hand, he led him out of the town, and when he had spit on his eyes and put his hands upon him, he asked him if he saw anything, and he looked up and he said, I see men like trees walking. And he put his hands on his eyes again, made him to look up, and he was restored, saw everyone clearly, and he sent him away to his house, and he said, neither go into the town nor tell anyone in the town. This is a miracle, the restoration of physical sight, that only Mark records. And it's unusual in the sense that there are some fairly unorthodox steps that Jesus takes to bring this man to be able to see. You got to love stories in the Bible where people bring friends to Jesus. By the way, a recent survey said that new believers do more heavy lifting than anyone else when it comes to evangelism. In fact, most people that meet Jesus are brought by someone who has known the Lord less than 2 years. It almost seems like you get saved, you're excited, you tell others, and you go, well, my job is done here. And then you coast for however many years you got after that. But the Lord doesn't change, and he's still able to save, and it is still your calling more than anything else. Get the gospel out, right? So here's a bunch of guys. We don't know anything about them, nor do we know anything about this blind man who says nothing, who is brought to Jesus. And I want you to notice they say to the Lord, and they have plenty of faith in him. I don't know about the blind guy, but the fellas do. And they said, Lord, please touch him. That's the way we think you should heal him. Just lay your hands upon him. And I thought that was very interesting that they come and they tell the Lord how to heal this man born blind. I went back and looked through the Gospels. There are 7 different healings of blind folks in the Gospels that Jesus comes in contact with. And every one of them is different. And I bring that up to you because God doesn't always work in the same way, but it's still God. And it's important that we are able to distinguish methods from the person. Because I think so often, you can hear someone's testimony of how the Lord healed them or how God worked in their lives or how God directed their steps, and you walk away going, all right, I'm going to start doing that. I'm going to start getting up at 4 in the morning like they did. I'm going to start eating Wheaties in the morning because they ate Wheaties. And then I'm going to expect God to speak. And I try to recreate the manner, if you will, right? The method by which God works. And that just doesn't work because God isn't like that. He's into relationship. And he certainly has many ways that he can touch your life. And it doesn't have to be the way that you desire. In fact, if you'll read through the Gospels, you'll find that Jesus sometimes just speaks to a blind man and they see. Other times he lays hands on them. Sometimes he spits in their eyes, even threw dirt in one guy's eyes. I mean, if we're going to start creating churches based on the Lord's method of healing eyes, you'd have the speak and be healed church and the spit and be healed church and here's mud in your eye fellowship, and it would all be the Lord. The only thing in common was Jesus showed up for all of those. But I like the fact that these guys come and they tell the Lord how he's to do his work. It is something we need to be careful about because God's not limited by method, and you should never use personal experience to develop doctrine. It just doesn't work that way. You have doctrine and you have personal experiences in the truth of God. That's the way it worked. But the experience of his touch might change. The grace of God does not change, right? So make the difference. And never limit God by putting up walls of, experience, if you will. This guy said nothing. Bartimaeus, by the way, the other blind guy that the Lord touched there in Mark, I think it's chapter 10, the next chapter, 2 chapters from now, he can't keep quiet. He's yelling and screaming, follow my voice, I'm over here, wanting to get healed. The Lord has different ways to work with different people. So they bring him to Jesus, and they said, well, just touch him. And notice in verse 23, the Lord leads him out of town. You should know that this is Bethsaida. It says so in verse 22. But Bethsaida, according to Matthew 11, was one of the towns that Jesus singled out to say that this was a place that there was no way God could work because of their unbelief. He had done so many miracles there. They should have come to the realization of he was long ago, and they didn't, and he's done with them. So he doesn't do the work in town. He does the work out of town. In fact, he says to him, notice in verse 26, don't go back in town. Don't even bother telling people in town, because it's not worth it. They're not listening. But that doesn't mean in the midst of a cursed city, he's not going to minister to the fellow who's looking to him. So Jesus takes him out of town, and he grabs him by the hand, and he walks him out, and then he spits in his eyes. And then he grabs him again. He says, you see anything? And the guy looks around, and he goes, sort of, right? And you read it, and you wonder if the Lord's running low on juice. Like maybe he needs to get charged, like he's down to like 20%. You can't really do much at 20%. But you have to believe that can't be the case. It's all about the person Jesus is ministering to, and I'm sure that regardless of the faith of the men who brought him, this man's faith needed to be built up. And the Lord gradually takes him along so that he might trust the Lord. Imagine being blind, and then the Lord does something in your eye, and you look and you go, well, I don't see real good yet, but there's something there. And now his hopes ring high, Now he sees colors and he sees shapes. Doesn't really see clearly, but touch me again, Lord. Now his belief is starting to raise up. And I like that because, to me, it says that God is more interested in your faith than in your healing. In other words, it's more important for him that this man believe in him than that he see, right? That's the most important. Let's develop his faith. His seeing is only going to last till he dies. And then that faith that he has will last forever. So what a lesson that God is most interested in our trust, in our fellowship with him. And if it takes stages of God working in your life to get you there, he'll get you there. My ways are beyond your finding out, Isaiah said, above your thoughts, right? So the Lord takes him and he ministers to him. And I love verse 25. He prays for him again, puts his hands on his eyes again. How about now? And now he goes, oh, that is perfect. The first LASIK in 2 parts right there. Look at that. God knows the way of salvation. God also knows the way better than we do. It's not worth telling God how to do his work. Just be available, and let him work in you. So he says to him, don't go back in town. For Bethsaida, it was too late. So the faith of an individual encouraged by the restoration of his physical sight. Change gears, proclamation of his spiritual insight, the revelation that God gives to all of us to know him. Verse 27. Now Jesus and his disciples went out to the towns of Caesarea Philippi. And on the road he asked his disciples, he said, who do men say that I am? And they said, well, John the Baptist, and some say you're Elijah, the others one of the prophets. He said to them, who do you say that I am? And Peter answered and said to him, you're the Christ. And he strictly warned them they should tell no one about him. Beginning here with this discussion that Jesus had with the boys up in the northern area, you can call it the continental divide in the Gospels, because it is truly a turning from the masses to the few. And this was a training that was going to take the last year and then some as the focus shifts. Now, understand that the disciples' understanding of the Messiah was not yours. The way you look at Jesus is not at all the way these apostles looked at Jesus. They looked at him as a political deliverer who was to come and to deliver them from the Romans, that we would be in charge and we would rule from Jerusalem and the world would bow at our feet. And their anticipation of the Messiah was just that. Well, Jesus wasn't that at all. That's not at all why he came. Next time he'll come to rule and reign. But in order for him to rule and reign in our lives, we're going to have to submit to his death and to his resurrection. We're going to have to see our relationship with him at the cross. And so that's the challenge that is before Jesus with this generational understanding of who the Messiah is. Caesarea Philippi, where the Lord confronts them and asks them about this, is an interesting place. It's about 25 miles north or so of the Sea of Galilee. It is at the headwaters of the Jordan. It is at the base of the largest mountain in the Mideast, Mount Hermon. It is 45 miles or so from Bethsaida. So it's a long way to the north. When we take our folks to Israel, we spend a day at a place called Tel Dan. Not go tell Dan stuff, but Tel means like mountain, right, or so. So it's the Dan Tel, the hill of Dan, if you will. Beautiful place, and it is where the rivers come together to make the Jordan. There is the Dan River, there's the Hasbani River, and then there's the Banyas River flow. But it's an interesting place. Herod Philip built it years and years ago. He built it as a Roman in honor of Caesar Augustus, who was worshipped as a god by the Romans. But the Greeks, when they took it over, founded 14 temples there to their gods that they worshiped, not just Baal, but the largest of them was a god called Pan. And Pan in Greek mythology was a man, half goat, and he played the pan flute. And so they worshiped, that's the largest altar in there. And then Jesus walks into this area and says to the disciples, hey, let's talk about me. Who do you think I am? Who do they think I am? And interesting, a place where the Romans come to worship Caesar and the Greeks come to worship Pan and others, Jesus now, way up in the north, says to his own boys, who do you think I am? Because that's the issue that's got to dominate the next year. Who am I? Why am I here? Why do you need me? What should you do because of me? And he asks them those simple, straightforward questions. Public opinion, according to verse 28 at this time, was pretty good. They thought he was the resurrection of John the Baptist. They thought he was Elijah. I think Matthew throws in there that he said, or Jeremiah, or maybe one of the prophets. His public opinion was favorable, and you know, they were sure God was with him, that he was a supernatural man. What amazes me, and maybe it shouldn't, is that no one in the crowd thought he could be the Messiah, the Savior. Because at least all of the things that the prophets told about the coming Messiah was that he would do the things Jesus did. Like what we just read, opening the eyes of the blind. It was one of those premier signs. You know, when you find someone opening the eyes of the blind, you should look twice, because that could be him. I don't think there were a lot of folks doing that. But somehow they missed that. They watched from afar. They loved him in the sense of, you know, they had good opinions about him, but they had no need for him, saw no relationship with him, and certainly didn't find themselves in their sin desiring him. And that's really why the Lord had come. And you read that and you say, well, why not? Well, mainly the concept of the Messiah. You know, there's a lot of people in churches this morning that don't believe that to get to heaven they need Jesus dying on a cross. They believe a lot of other things. You know, sincere maybe, you know, well-meaning maybe, you know, in touch with God in a distant sense, arm's length, but really no conviction that they need a Savior, that they need to be forgiven. And yet that's the key to the whole gospel message, isn't it? And so they missed Jesus, even though he stood before them. What they wanted was politics. They wanted a conqueror, a redeemer. Secondly, in order to know Jesus, you need divine revelation. You can't come up with this on your own. Somebody gives you a bunch of Bibles and go, all right, figure it out. You'll never figure it out. It requires divine revelation. And the Bible says divine revelation is given to those who are hungry to know. It just doesn't come on you like, hey, I should use it, I don't know. No, if you're hungry to know, God is willing to let you know, have you know. Who do men say that I am? Well, they've got all kinds of ideas and they're all good. Well, who do you say that I am? And by the way, it should tell you that you should never follow public opinion when it comes to Jesus. You'll always get it wrong. The second question, verse 29, is certainly the most important one. What do you think? What do you say? And though we are told in the other Gospels that the group all agreed, Peter tends to be the spokesman, you know, and he speaks up and he said, Matthew records the whole thing, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. You're the one we've been waiting for. The word Christ is Christos. It means Messiah or Mashiach or the one that was to come. They might say, good, you got it. And yes, he got it. And yes, In order to get it, God had to speak to Peter, and Peter was hungry to know. But understand that Peter's understanding of the Messiah was still not the Messiah that God intended. And so they wanted what everyone else wanted, political deliverer, and it had nothing to do about their sins. Now Jesus says in verse 30, don't tell anyone. Why? Because if the disciples at this point would have went out and went, he's the Messiah, it wouldn't be long before there was a political movement staffed by loyal, unregenerate people. The movement would have been, exciting. Make Jerusalem great again. But there would have been no relationship with God because their expectation or their anticipation of the Messiah was not at all spiritual. It was political. So Jesus would announce it when the time was right. In fact, when he rides on into town on that donkey on Palm Sunday, and the Pharisees say, hey, tell the people to stop worshiping you. They're worshiping you as if you're God. He said, I can't stop them. And if they stop, the rocks would cry out on this my day, the day that belongs to your peace, the day that had been foretold. And he presents himself not only as the Messiah, but as the Savior. But that's a long way from the hearts of these folks. And so that's what Jesus is dealing with this next year. Know the Lord. And you remember from Matthew's gospel that Jesus said to Peter and the rest, you didn't come up with this on your own. That took divine revelation. God spoke to you. Restoration, it's a work of God. It says who he is. Revelation is what's necessary to know him as God. But they had a lot to learn. Verse 31 says, beginning then to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected of the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and after 3 days he would rise again. Matthew 16:21 begins with the words, from that time on. Luke writes the same thing. In fact, verse 32, it says, he spoke this word openly, and it's the word for plainly or clearly with them. So here for the first time in the 3.5-year public ministry of Jesus in the last 12 months, Jesus turns to the disciples and says, by the way, I should probably tell you the whole agenda. Hadn't told them this yet, wasn't necessary, wasn't that near to things, but now they were going to head for Jerusalem. Luke would say he's going to set his face steadfastly there. He was going to be determined to go there. This was now the last act, if you will, right, before the cross. And so Jesus now turns their attention to the real purpose for why he came and who he is. And he says very shortly here, but very detailed, hey, look, I just want you to know I'm going to suffer and be rejected by every class of religious leader, by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes. I'm going to be killed. And every time he says this, he adds, 3 days later, I'm going to rise. Now, understand how upsetting this was to these guys. They never heard, and 3 days later, I'm going to rise. Not one time. In fact, you can read, I think it's in Luke chapter 24, where the Lord, after the resurrection, it says, and then they remembered his words. Oh, he said he was going to rise. The only people that seem to have taken it to heart before the cross were the Romans, or the enemies, the elders, the scribes, and the Pharisees. They went to Herod and said, we need to set a watch. The third day, he said he'd rise. The disciples didn't get it all because they stopped when they heard Messiah dead. Yeah, that's not the Messiah we're looking for. Yeah, maybe you don't get it. And so it moved them. The Son of Man is a title in the Bible of humiliation. You find it in Daniel chapter 7, but you find the description of the Son of Man's suffering in Isaiah 52 and Isaiah 53, and it was missed by most. But all of the factions of the Sanhedrin rejected the Lord. Now, if you're in that group of 12 and you've given the right answer, you're the Lord, you're the Messiah, the Mashiach, you're the Savior, and they hear, well done, God spoke to you, my Father in heaven showed you that, and they went, that's right. And then they hear, I'm going to die. Let me lay out for you the program the next 12 months. It isn't much of a surprise that in the next verse we read, or verse 32, then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. And when he turned around, Jesus did, and he looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. A lot of rebuking going on here. Get behind me, Satan. You're mindful of the things of God. You're not mindful of the things of God, but of the things of men. Now, Peter, I think, probably felt he got another vision now. I know he's the Messiah, and I know he's all wet when it comes to his plan. So Jesus, just come over here. Maybe you didn't understand the whole Messiah thing. I'm here to help you. And he lays it out. And Jesus looked at him, looks at the guys, and then lets Peter have it. And it is one of those harsh words that you read in the Bible. Can you imagine being Peter and getting like this humiliated in front of your friends who you'd been arguing about? I think I'm going to be the greatest. And then the Lord said, "You get behind me, Satan." Right? But here's the explanation. You're more concerned with the ways of man than the ways of God. And that's exactly what this view of the Messiah is. And the reason it's so harsh is because it's too important. You know, Satan's philosophy grips, like I said, many hearts. There are plenty of folks today who assume you don't need the cross. You don't need a dead Messiah. You don't need to go the way of the blood to be saved. Salvation can come in different ways, 100 different ways. Do good, mean well, try harder, whatever it is. I've done my best. If God isn't happy with that, I don't know what he's going to be happy with. The answer is he's going to be happy with you turning into his son and not trampling his blood under your feet as if somehow it's a cheap deal. But that's the battle here. And notice the apostles have just as much trouble as the world does grabbing hold of it. You're God, okay. If I'm God, then this is the way it's going to go. If I'm the Messiah, then this is the reason the Messiah has come. Peter, you're an offense to me because you can't distinguish between the will of man and the will of God. And he goes from stone to stumbling block in about 30 seconds, from anointed to dope, right? What? Get behind me, Satan. Be careful of embracing Jesus when you need him and refusing him when his ways don't work for you. His ways are the only ways. His name is the only name. So he sat them down to speak to them. He talked to them about and rebuked Peter and said, look, that's not the way of God. That's not the plan of God. In restoration, he brings sight to a blind man physically. In Revelation, he makes himself known. But then there's this reminder in verses 34 down through verse 38 of what we then have to do in response. He said in verse 34, Mark writes, when he had called the people to himself and his disciples with him, he said, whoever of you would desire to come after me, let him deny himself. Let him take up his cross. Let him follow me. Whoever desires to save his life is going to lose it. But if you lose your life for my sake and the gospel's, you'll save it. What will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? What will a man give in exchange for his soul? Whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous, sinful generation, of him the Son of Man also will be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. So, restoration of the man blind, revelation of divine blindness or blindness that God divinely heals, as he does for all of us. But then there's one more issue, and it's the issue that is the struggle between the apostles' understanding of God and what he truly has come to do, and that is, if he's the Lord, you're not. Right? In fact, he gives 3 little phrases. You want to follow me? Deny yourself, pick up your cross, and follow. Deny yourself. In other words, there's a cost to embracing Jesus. There's a cost to you that while the world views him as much less than you do, that to follow him means this is the end of your ways, right? You're signing up for saying, all right, you drive. Here's the keys to the house, vacation plans, goals in life. You write them out. It is the end of your ways. It's the beginning of his. A life of faith in Jesus means you die to yourself. You don't sit on the throne. You don't make the rules. He does. And that was Peter's problem. Peter went, you're the Lord. And he goes, you're right, Peter. My Father showed you. And you're not going to die. Yeah, you get behind me, Peter. Now you're not distinguishing between the two. A true disciple of Jesus removes himself from the throne. Willfully so. Lets him be the Lord. You want to follow me? Deny yourself. And then take up your cross. Because to follow Jesus requires a willingness to bear up the shame and the rejection and the reproach and the suffering that identifying with him in this world will bring you. Unfortunately, people have taken this bearing my cross and have misinterpreted it so poorly. I had a guy say to me one time, I'm married to this woman, she is such a terror, but everyone's got their cross to bear. Your wife is not your cross. Neither is that unfair teacher in your classroom at school. Neither is that bossy friend of yours. Whenever you read the terms of death upon a cross, it is that idea that you suffer shame for his name's sake. Look, if you walk with Jesus in this world, you might lose a job, or you might lose an opportunity that you would normally have. You might lose friends or family that don't care about you. I don't want anything to do with you. You're walking with Jesus. That becomes your cross. And that's the cross that you have to bear. Look, difficulty in life is no indicator of cross-bearing. Difficulty for Jesus' sake is. And that's the distinction. When you suffer because of your allegiance and alliance and stand with him, that is truly bearing a cross. Jesus said, you want to follow me? I'm the Lord. If you suffer for following me, that's fine. Take it on the chin, man, because this is the way it's going to be in the world. They hated me before they hated you. You've got to be willing to stand with him, no matter what. And the cross is the suffering and the rejection and the difficulty that we get when we put Jesus ahead of ourselves. And then he said, you got to stay close. The word follow me literally is the word for don't drift. Don't get off track. Don't trail off. Stay close behind. We'll read in a year from now, at least time-wise, Peter following the Lord afar off. It just got him in trouble. You follow the Lord afar off, it's going to get you in trouble. You got to be in sight of headquarters all the time. And then notice in verse 35, Jesus, and down through the end, gives them rationale for this. He said, in many ways, the keepers are the losers. You want to keep your life, you want to keep your ways, you want to keep it your way, you're going to lose. There's nothing in you and in your life that's going to lead to life. But if you'll lay down your life, if you'll come my way, if I'll be your Lord, you'll win. You can't lose. And one day when I come, I won't be ashamed of you because you haven't been ashamed of me. What really profit is there in gaining the world and losing your soul? What would it mean to you to be the richest person in hell? I got more money than everybody. Good for you. Put it on simmer. Or to be the smartest guy in hell, or the most popular guy in hell. In fact, the Lord even says in verse 37, what price is your price? Do you have a price? Can you be bought? Satan's always coming up with offers to turn you from this way of life. What is your price? What will a man give in exchange for his soul? What's your price? The judgment of man will be that when the Lord returns as judge and rewarder, our willingness to live for him and represent him and stand for him will be what causes him to stand for us. No way to separate the two. So in the context where he demonstrates his power over physical illness and says to Peter, what you know about me is divine. He then says, because of Peter's correction and rebuke, look, if you're going to follow me, I'm going to have to be the Lord. You're going to have to lay down your ideas of what you want and the way you want and the things you think I should do, and you're going to have to let me be the Lord. And if you'll do that, dying to yourself, you'll have life. And it'll be difficult, and life will be tough in the world. It's not going to be so easy. You're not going to be well accepted or well liked. The true Christians have always been in the minority from the day that the church was born till today. But I want the Lord to not be ashamed of me, don't you? You want to hear, well done, not, who are you? A restoration, a revelation, and a reminder of who's who. He is God. He is God. He's God. He's God. It's a hard lesson. The disciples will take a year to learn it and then some. I guess we'd be good if we learned it that fast. Father, thank you this morning for your faithfulness to us. You are indeed the Lord. And it is through these lessons of Lord, thinking about what the disciples' expectation was and what your plan was that teaches us that so often, even our best plans when we are in a place where we love you and want to serve you can be awfully wrong. And that you have plans. And it is those plans that we want to find. It is your will that we want to surround ourselves with. It is your ways that we want to walk in. And we want to die to ourselves, and we do want to pick up the cross, and we want to follow, stay close behind. Not run ahead, not trail so far off, but just be in step with you, the author and the finisher of our faith. Maybe this morning, that whole issue of the Lord being your Lord is the crux of what you struggle with. It isn't that you don't love God. But you have many ideas about what God should be and what God should do. And maybe you've been angry with him or even have held yourself back from him because he hasn't done all that you think he should do. And I would challenge you to rethink your whole position. I think he should just be the Lord, and you should just submit to him. Oh, ask. You should ask. And seek and knock. But then rest in his decisions. He's a wise God. He's able to do more than you could ask or think. But he has a plan for you. And in the big picture here, he had a plan to save the world, but the disciples were sure he was going to be a ruler in Jerusalem. He was going to give his life for the sins of man. They just wanted him to set up an office downtown where they could have offices with him. They had limited God in their understanding, but Jesus was going to take a year to convince them that this is the way he had planned to come, that the Father had sent his Son to die, that without his death, we don't live. It's a hard lesson for these guys to change their opinion about God and who he should be. It can be a hard lesson for us to change our understanding and that we begin to listen to what God has to say about himself and then follow him. He's the Lord. He'll be the Lord when you're long gone. So submit to him as Lord. Stay close to him and live for him even when the cross you bear can be heavy and difficult. It'll be well worth it in that day. You don't want to exchange your soul for something of value only in this life, temporary value. And if that's you this morning, the pastors will be up front. We'd love to pray with you to make your commitment sure, to surrender all. Lord, help me to walk with you and let you be Lord of my life. It's the issue, really, isn't it? The one we face all the time. Lord, take my life. We'd love to pray with you this morning. Shall we stand?